some of the work that's been done on optical illusions, and I'm thinking particularly of some of the work reported at least by Ramachandran in that great series on illusions that Scientific American runs. Some of that work seems to suggest that there is a kind of natural faculty within the brain which processes visual information with the assumption that light always comes from the top. And I'm thinking particularly of illusions that have to do with concave and convex surfaces. If, for example, a two-dimensional disk is shaded such that the hard to describe without drawing a picture. If a circle on a piece of paper is shaded such that the shading is at the bottom, it looks like it's being illuminated from the top, and that's not right. Anyway, I'll see if I can find a link to put to that. But we seem to have a default setting within our brains, at least, that assumes that objects that we see are going to be lit from the top, and that's part of the mechanism by which we can create the illusion of three-dimensionality on two-dimensional surfaces by the judicious use of shading and so on. I think one of the other attributes of this assumption, and it's a completely logical assumption, because as embodied animals walking through space, usually the light does come from the top. It's only really since the advent of fire, I suppose, but more recently gas and electric lighting, that it's been possible to place sources of illumination anywhere other than up above in the sky, meaning that we are, I would imagine, hardwired to expect light to come from the top and to make intuitive judgments about the shape of objects and so on based on that hardwired assumption. It seems to, which is underpinning those illusions. One of the interesting side effects of that, if it is a side effect, I think, is that becomes part of our schema for understanding other things. And the one I'm particularly interested in, which I've spoken of a couple of times before in these videos, is a kind of spatial understanding of what knowledge constitutes. And I've talked a bit before about vertical dimension as opposed to the horizontal dimension, in which we conceive different kinds of knowing as being placed at different spatial relationships to ourselves. And I've spoken about the vertical dimension in that regard. But this thing about light seems to play into that. There's a close correspondence between metaphors of light and knowing, generally, and that's really well expanded in this really nice book called, what's it called? It's by Arthur Zajonc, and it's something like The Entwined History of Light and Mind. It's got a main title and a subtitle. But we do have this close relationship between light and knowing, and it appears in all sorts of different forms. It appears in phrases like illumination or flash of insight or enlightenment in the broadest sense, both in the rational enlightenment sense and in the less rational, perhaps spiritual sense. It also appears in graphic form in the form of light bulbs going on over people's heads and so on. So there's a close relationship between knowing in all its forms and light. And I think this light metaphor kind of collides with the vertical metaphor that I've spoken before. In the vertical metaphor, in which knowledge is understood differently according to a sort of vertical dimension, most clearly illustrated by a phrase attributed to Isaac Newton, where he said, "If I have seen further than other men, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants." There's a sense in which verticality, elevated position, allows one to see further and hence know more. Allied to that vertical dimension is this sense of light. So as one ascends, and in this kind of hypothetical, metaphorical viewing position and gains access to greater knowledge, so one enters a more brightly lit space, just as you kind of do when you go up in an aeroplane. You go above the clouds and suddenly the sun comes at you in this brightly lit space. And when you raise your eyes from the ground to the sky, there's a very clear gradient of illumination experienced, one which I said before is hardwired. So I think in this knowledge paradigm, metaphorical knowledge paradigm, in which verticality accords with greater access to knowledge, so it also accords with greater illumination. Which I suspect is why we keep getting these tied relationships between metaphors. So for example, metaphors of spiritual illumination are also usually phrased in terms of metaphors of spiritual ascendancy. So higher power, when we talk about a higher power, a God or something like that, but when we talk about that, we don't only gesture towards a higher space, we also imagine that space as being more brightly lit, if there is a heaven. And my guess is it's not gloomy, as of course the other place is distinctly gloomy. Most metaphors which draw on that metaphor of height also make either overt or covert relationship reference to greater illumination. So again, I think there's quite a clear relationship between light and height, and it's not an accidental or a random relationship. It seems to me logical that would be drawn from the very real embodied relationship between light and height that we experience every day and have for millions of years as inhabitants of a planet orbiting a star and being effectively illuminated from the top.